The Nomiki Show.
Very excited to have Ricardo Valadez on. He is the private equity campaign manager at Americans for Financial Reform, which is a nonpartisan and nonprofit coalition of more than 200 civil rights, consumer, labor, business, investor, faith-based, and civic and community groups, which formed in the wake of the 2008 economic crisis. I'm old enough to remember that and live it and experience it. Thank you so much for joining the show, Ricardo.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm fascinated by the work you're doing right now as it relates to the economic crisis that we're in now, involving private equity. So, but just before we get to like the present state of where we are, how much did private equity play a role in like the post 2008 economic crisis? Is private equity's sort of I don't know, craving for economic disasters or whatever it is, the opportunities attached to them. Is this a new thing that came out of 2008 or has it already existed?
Well, the industry existed before 2008, but they did take that economic crisis as a real growth opportunity. And, you know, we have quotes from the time, from investor calls of private equity executives, really, getting excited and salivating at the devastation in the housing market, for example, that occurred after the 2008 crisis, and they really did take that opportunity to pounce on low prices. If you want to take the housing market, for example, they bought up tons of real estate and consolidated that to become the largest landlord in the country at one time, in the form of Invitation Homes, which now is still a major renter in the housing market, and they're poised to jump on the current crisis in the same way.
In the same way that they're expecting more foreclosures or more renters to leave. I mean, how does this kind of play out in this version of the housing crisis that we're facing? We just don't have an accurate number.
Yeah, so the private equity industry has been a major driver in the corporatization of housing, whether it's in manufactured housing or apartments or single family homes. They're continuing to invest heavily in the housing market, often crowding out individual buyers and small, mom and pop rental or landlords.
So let's conceptualize the crisis that we're in the midst of right now. If you live in New York, where I live, we're facing an eviction moratorium expiration very soon, and it's been mind-boggling to me because yes, rental rates have gone down, but they haven't gone down to the extent that we all thought. Landlords have received a little bit of support, but my immediate thought is, well, what about the small landlord? I live in Queens. There's a lot of small landlords there. Not as many as there used to be, but for the most part, there are plenty of duplexes and small apartment buildings that are owned by grandmas who invested there 50 years ago. Are they at risk of losing their property being bought up by these bigger companies?
Yeah, that is a real concern. One of the trends that we see in the housing industry when it comes to private equity is their ability to come in and make cash offers and buy properties, often well over asking price, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars over asking price, and that puts in jeopardy a lot of folks who may not have access to that sort of capital, right? Another trend we've been seeing is that, yes, there is the eviction moratorium is coming to an end, and we do expect, unfortunately, a wave of evictions. But another factor in that is that many corporate landlords not only have been, poised for evictions, but they've also been not extending leases, and so you will have a lot of folks who are evicted, but also folks who aren't able to extend leases. And what that allows them to do is really drive rental rates higher with new tenants.
And they've been doing this for years. It's not like this is a new concept. They'll find little ways within the loopholes to, not to either just make sure that the apartments are like falling apart and people don't want to renew their leases or whatever it is, so that they can remodel it and double the price.
Yeah, and what we've seen, across this is not just an issue in housing. What we've seen across the private equity industry is that they're often involved in drivers of some of the worst practices, some of the worst and most egregious business practices that we see in the country, whether that's driving up prices in healthcare for consumers, like you mentioned, driving up rental rates, increasing fees, and squeezing renters, or buying up retail and squeezing workers, and driving bankruptcies across the economy. Private equity is responsible for some of the worst practices when it comes to workers and consumers.
So let's talk about healthcare. Obviously, can you explain how does this play out, and how does it kind of go head to head with this fight for Medicare for all, or the stall on any real legislative focus on Medicare for all?
Well, private equity's role in healthcare has changed over the years, but wherever they get involved, what we've seen is higher prices for consumers, and often a lot of mess in the wake after they sort of walk away with profits. So, a decade or so ago, they were interested in buying up a lot of hospitals, and so they bought a lot of hospitals, many community hospitals, and the result of private equity's involvement there was the closing of a lot of safety net hospitals. That the private equity business model is to really buy up assets, squeeze as much money as they can from them, and then offload them, whatever the result, right? So that could mean workers losing their jobs, communities losing their hospitals. Really, the private equity industry isn't concerned with what they leave behind. And so in healthcare, one of the trends we're seeing now is they've been engaged in a lot of what's called roll-ups in the healthcare space. So that what that means is they buy a lot of practices in, for example, dermatology or dentistry, and they'll roll them up into one big company. And then, they can manipulate prices and kind of create stealth monopolies in certain markets using those practices. So that's something we're tracking currently. Yeah.
So it seems really interesting. It's like they find, whether in the real estate aspect or even retail, I guess the same. If there is a crisis, an economic crisis, obviously, pandemic is a different type of crisis that created an economic crisis, or even a climate crisis, for instance, buying up distressed real estate that has, I look at Puerto Rico as a classic example, so it seems like there's the strategy of following the crisis and maybe not fighting some of the crises like climate change. But then simultaneously, there's this healthcare crisis where it's very clear that we have a broken healthcare system in our country, and they're capitalizing off that as well. Is this an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. One of the advantages that private equity has is that they sit on massive amounts of cash that they're able to deploy, and so they'll wait for whether it's low housing stock or an opportunity that they see to squeeze consumers and make money in healthcare or housing. They're really in every part of the economy, even in places you would never imagine. They're huge in entertainment. They just, for folks familiar with Cirque du Soleil, private equity drove them into bankruptcy last year.
What do you mean by drove them into bankruptcy?
That's a good question. So private equity, one of the things that's key to private equity's business model is the use of debt to buy companies. And so if you or I were to go buy a house or a car and take out a loan or a mortgage, we would be responsible for paying that back. But the private equity business model relies on what's called a leveraged buyout, in which the debt is placed on the company that's being bought. So the private equity firm itself has no liability for the money that was for the debt that was put on those companies. And so we saw that practice drive a lot of bankruptcies in retail, at a time when retail was going through transitions, to online and the stores were changing. Private equity, bills itself as coming in and providing, leadership and capital, during those transitions. But what they actually do is pile on debt that makes it harder for those companies to transition, because they actually also have to pay the debt that was put on them, sometimes tens of billions of dollars in the case of Toys R Us and others. And so that practice drives bankruptcy, and they use debt not only to buy the companies, but they also can then force those companies to take on additional loans to pay back, to buy back stocks. And what that does is give them, make the private equity firms a lot richer, but saddles the company with additional debt that they have to service and pay back, and make it harder for them to survive. So that's one way they drive companies into bankruptcy.
So what's interesting about this, though, I'm, and forgive my naivete, like, the company is valuable enough for them to do all this and keep it alive to an extent. Is there some hope that once they take control, the company will rebound? And so they're making money in the crisis. They're creating a crisis for the company, or exacerbating whatever, predatory, and then take hold of the company because they still see the value in that company in the long term.
Yeah. So that does occur sometimes, but what private equity is really playing is a high reward, low stakes game. And because they can use debt that they're not responsible for, it puts them in a position to take a lot of risk. So if they put a tiny amount, 2 to 3% of their own money into a big deal, and drive about the deal with about 60 to 70% debt typically. And so if the company goes bad, they lose a small amount of money. But if it goes well, they still make money. And if it goes bad, often because of the ways they loot the company while they have it, they often still make money even if the company goes bankrupt.
It's a win-win-win-win-win-win-win-win-win.
Right, except for the workers and consumers who now are left, with no jobs, maybe no pensions or lower pensions, often no severance, and the communities that are left without beloved brands like Toys R Us and Payless Shoes. Yeah.
So let's talk about the workers. When private equity comes in, and obviously we're pivoting to retail. Retail has been affected in so many ways over the last, since online, since folks started buying things online, but also in this pandemic, even more so, as Amazon has done better than ever. Brick and mortar stores have just, like restaurants and every other small business. So how have workers been affected? Specifically, not, I guess let's separate the two. There's the pandemic problems, the problems of, companies not getting the business, and also, workers not being able to go into work. Aside from that, how have workers been affected by private equity swooping in and taking advantage of this situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, because private equity only cares about the short term, and squeezing the company as for for a short time. Workers' pay and benefits and investment in the workforce is often, one of the first places they go to cut costs. So in retail, in brand after brand and store after store, what we've seen is, benefits being eroded, pay being squeezed, jobs being cut, stores being closed, and private equity finding ways to squeeze money for the short term, even if it makes the store less attractive to work there long term, but also to shop at. So we've heard from workers at stores when private equity comes in and buys a store that they may start spending less on some of the core processes that make the store look good or make the produce fresh in grocery stores, for example. And so again, that can undermine the long-term viability of the company, but the private equity company is not concerned about that because it helps their bottom line in the short term.
This is extremely horrifying.
Yeah, it is.
So we have the Biden administration now. Supposedly, they're going to be taking consumer affairs and taking on Wall Street a little bit more seriously. Is this happening? Is there any sign that that's actually there, especially in an economic crisis like this? I mean, you can't move slowly on things like this.
Yeah, there are certainly opportunities, for us to rein in the industry. There are, regulatory things that the administration can do, and then there's also, opportunities to pass legislation that would fundamentally change the business model, and stop some of the worst practices, limit their ability to pile on debt. Change bankruptcy law so that workers are, not as vulnerable when bankruptcies do occur. And so there really are some opportunities now. And there's a growing awareness of the industry and their role in the economy. So, yeah, we do see some opportunities.
Fascinating. Ricardo, I would love to have you back on to talk more to see how this evolves in the next few months and if the Biden administration and Congress decides to take this seriously enough to do something big and bold. But really great conversation and, keep up the amazing work.
Thank you so much.
Not easy.
Would love to be back.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ricardo.